Not a day goes by without reading in the media about extensive cyber attacks that affect companies, organizations, and authorities. Behind the scenes, our global threat intelligence team at PwC works around the clock to help our customers prevent, detect, and actively counter cyber terrorists. So back by popular demand for the second year in a row, to tell us more about how they investigate and gather information about these hacker groups, as well as give us a look ahead at what we can expect in the near future, is our colleague Matt Carey, the PwC Head of Cyber Threat Intelligence for Europe, Middle East, and Africa.
Here you go, Matt.
Oh. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Mons. And welcome back from lunch. I'll try my best to keep you awake after your excellent feasting. My name is Matt Carey, as it says on the slide, and I am the head of EMEA Threat Intelligence for PwC. I'm also the head of PwC Sweden's cyber threat intelligence capability. I'm going to be speaking in English today for this lecture. However, om ni vill lyssna på mig prata på svenska om cyber threat intelligence och sårbarheter kan ni lyssna på PwC's podcast på webbsidan, och det finns en podcast om threat intelligence på svenska med att diskutera det med en kollega. Okay. So my background before I came to PwC around about a year ago was in government agencies, more or less, and my last stint was in the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK. It looks after basically everything from information security to worrying about what cyber threat actors are doing for the entirety of the UK, and produces a lot of intelligence and information and advisories on that. You now have a National Cybersecurity Centre here in Sweden, which is doing very similar things. And basically, when I left my job, I was the head of cyber risk consultancy for government, so I spent a lot of time worrying about what cyber threats were doing to government organisations and agencies, all the way from local government to the national level type central government organisations, and trying to provide government with advice and guidance on how they could actually mitigate or remediate those threats. And as we gradually came into the situation where there was going to be a war in the Ukraine, and there was a lot of concern and worry about what that meant in terms of potential cyber attacks against the UK, I was involved in helping to provide advice and guidance for organisations across the UK and how to defend against that. We still have a war in the Ukraine. We still have Russian Nexus cyber threats out there, as well as many others. So a lot of that advice and guidance is still very much relevant today. PwC's threat intelligence team is located right across the world. So we have a team of about 35 people who are spread all the way from Australia through to the Americas, with a lot of us sitting here in Europe and many of us in the UK. And we cover a number of different types of intelligence operations, but the main focus, of course, with cyber threat intelligence is the techniques, tactics, and procedures of cyber threat actors and the technical information relating to that, which helps our customers and other organizations identify whether these hackers are actually present on their network, whether they're trying to break into their networks, and also give them the technical information that they need to try and defend against these hackers on their own organization's networks by applying those technical indicators on their SIEMs, in their detection mechanisms, on their endpoints when they're actually doing endpoint detection, to try and identify where the hacker is basically before they get on the network, and then subsequently to try and identify them potentially after they've been on the network if there's a major incident, and find out what the root cause of the incident was, who was behind it, and what sort of techniques and procedures they use. So we have a very big role in helping our PwC incident response teams to accomplish that goal. In general, our threats are divided into four main categories. So we have espionage actors who are very concerned with attempting to steal information from organisations. If we're talking about government organisations, that might be state secrets or sensitive information that would otherwise give another nation a degree of strategic advantage over another nation by drawing in that intelligence. Gone are the days, well, not entirely gone are the days when you'll get a somebody approaching you in a bar to try and elicit information from you by becoming your friend and then trying to get intelligence out of you. However, the majority of the espionage that we see these days is really through electronic means, where people, hackers effectively, government hackers, will try and break into government networks and steal information from organisations. But it's not just government networks, it's a lot of corporate networks as well. So we do see an enormous amount of intellectual property theft from organisations. You have a number of very important large-scale private sector organisations here in Sweden who have a presence in like hundreds of different countries across the world, who do produce very interesting, very kind of like cutting-edge technologies and methodologies that threat actors are very interested in getting hold of. And so we do see espionage in the private sector space as well as the government space. We see an enormous amount of criminal activity, and in fact, every organisation in Sweden, every organisation represented in this room is a target for cyber criminal activity. And we've seen that go from relatively large proportions of attacks against individual organisations, now plague proportion attacks against every possible organisation and sector out there. There's also hacktivists. Now, in the past, hacktivists would have been groups like Anonymous or other groups which would have gone after specific organisations in order to prove a political point. But now, with the advent of the war in the Ukraine, as well as the war that's happening between Hamas and Israel, there's a lot of patriotic hackers out there that are either for one side or the other side, who are busy deploying various kinds of tools like DDoS tools and other tools designed to harm networks or deface websites, etc., which they're using to make that political point and try and score points for one side or the other. And we have sabotage actors, some of whom are state-sponsored, but obviously if you get a very bad ransomware attack, it's a form of sabotage as well. It stops you producing the goods and services that you're actually meant to produce as an organisation. It can put you out of business, obviously, and there are lots of different things in that category. However, the majority of these come down to either malware, malicious software, which will stop the network from working in some kind of way, or will lock it up so that it can't work and you can't actually access any important information, any client information, the sort of information that you need to actually function as an organisation. Threat intelligence as a capability is important for a number of different parts of cybersecurity. Identity and access management on the one hand, because a lot of state-sponsored actors, at least at the moment, are going after cloud deployments, and the way into the cloud is very much by intercepting information about usernames and passwords and multi-factor authentication and codes, etc. It's also about risk management, because if you understand the threat, then you can actually manage the risk around it. If you don't understand what the threat is, then the risk is a giant nebulous kind of thing that you can't properly address in a way that actually makes sense from a budgetary security point of view or from a practical security point of view. So understanding what the threat is capable of and then prioritising the security investments you make is extremely important to risk management. There are new regulatory requirements coming in. So throughout Europe, we've had TIBA for a while for financial institutions as threat assessment type regulatory requirement. We've got DORA coming in for financial institutions now everywhere, where monitoring of the threat and detection of threats is a compulsory requirement for organisations to have some capability in that area. And we've got NIST too, and I'm sure that if you haven't had a talk on that today, it's coming. And then, of course, incident response, where people get hit by an actor, they don't know who it is, they want to know afterwards who's done it and then how they actually got in so that they can protect themselves for the future. Very soon, in the next few weeks, we will be releasing our annual Cyber Threat Intelligence report called the Year in Retrospect report. That one basically draws together all the key bits of information that we've produced on the threat actors that we track in the past year. And it comes out kind of this time of year, like March or April, not because we're really slow and we can't actually put one out in January, but we really want to do the due diligence with regard to everything that has happened right up until the end of December to produce the most complete picture of what has happened in 2023, according to us, that we possibly can to provide that to customers. And some of that will replicate similar information, other reports that you will see from Microsoft and a range of other vendors, threat intelligence vendors that are out there. But we do have a lot of unique threat intelligence sources within PwC, which give us our own unique perspective. And it's why we do sit at the table with a lot of very big national security agencies, as well as multinational companies and private companies who consume our threat intelligence because of that uniqueness and the general quality of the research that we produce in that space. But today I'm going to give you a bit of an insight into what is going to come from that report and what you can expect to see, give you some highlights from what we saw in 2023, and trying to explain that to you in the Swedish context as well, which I think is important. So the key themes that we observed over the period of 2023, we had obviously a lot of zero-day attacks, nolldagar in Swedish, and critical vulnerabilities that were exploited by actors. It was both serious kind of state-sponsored threat actors who did that, as well as all the major cybercriminal groups, especially the ransomware groups that went after that. There were several big attacks here in Sweden in the past year. One of them was the Tieto-Evry attack, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. It affected over 120 different authorities here in Sweden and a large range of private sector companies. That was an example of where potentially there was an exploitation of a critical vulnerability in order to actually, for the criminals to actually get access to the network in the first place. We had a lot of geopolitical influence on the cyber threat landscape, so the continuing war in Russia and the Ukraine, with threat actors actually trying to develop cyber capabilities to deploy in a war setting and apply it as a kind of a combined or aggregated form of battle attack method, especially in terms of like going into particular battle areas and taking out electricity grids or taking over multimedia type outlets to actually deprive people of the ability to get information. All these things have started to come out over the past year, both through wiper malware and through other means. And of course, we see a lot of the patriotic hacker groups like Killnet and No-Name 057, as well as some of the Turkish supposedly affiliated groups who committed attacks, DDoS attacks against Swedish organisations due to the Quran burning kind of incidents and other things that influenced those patriotic hackers to go after these organisations. Supply chain compromises were absolutely everywhere. So even if your organisation has magnificent security and you've done all the right things, you've got all your NIST and ISO 27001 reviews up to the highest level and your maturity is good, you are bound to have a bunch of different third-party suppliers, either software that you consume or other organisations which have privileged access into your network, whose security will not be quite necessarily as good as yours, and they're the ones that the hackers go after. They love MSPs in particular, so your managed service providers who basically provide some kind of like service for your organisation. Sometimes it might be something like a secure document transfer service. It could be a contract storage service. It could be something like a cloud service. If those organisations have poor security, the hackers go after them. They get a nice presence on their network, and then they identify who all their customers are. Then they try and identify all the different credentials that they can get in relation to the customers, and then use the privileged access that the organisation has to then get into those customers' networks. And that's what we've seen mostly, and including actually some very clever hacking techniques to compromise the actual software updating capabilities of various different companies, so that you actually create malicious updates and then you send them out looking like they're legitimately from the company. Your security people do the right thing, try and patch these vulnerabilities that are out there using these updates, and suddenly you're infected too. So that's something that's been very, very prevalent. obviously there's been a lot of, but state actors don't give up their jobs just because it's 2023 or 2024. They're constantly looking to try and satisfy intelligence requirements, strategic requirements. What we have seen, though, is them try to anonymise what they do much more than they have previously. So try to use tools which aren't as easy to identify as being them behind them, but also try and use networks where they're basically compromising home routers or other kind of like torrent type networks in order to then propagate their malware, attack targets without it being easily traced back to them that's doing it. So that's one thing. And we'll see in other areas where some of these supply chain compromises have come to the fore as well in this space. Ransomware is at an all-time high. So we have seen at least 1.5 to 2 times as much ransomware activity as we had in previous years. And it's only getting increasing, basically. So we expect to see in 2024 that there's going to be a much greater incidence of this going forwards. So some of the things that we saw in 2023, apologies, I'm just getting over a cold, so that's why I'm losing my voice a bit. Thank you, Mons. ChatGPT, AI, is something that everybody's using now, and threat actors are using it as well. We had White Austeris, which is the group that we call behind the actual clot malware campaign, exploiting things like document transfer facilities like MoveIt to actually go after victims. We had a group called Star Fraud conducting very high profile attacks against organisations, including in the hospitality sector, and they're more of a hybrid group that actually goes after not just the network of their victims, but they're also connected to organised crime. So people in their affiliate organisations who don't do what they say may get a visit from them on a dark night, and something unfortunate might happen. I've mentioned the war in Ukraine. I've mentioned the supply chain compromises by North Korean actors. And this was the first year where we've seen the US take a step to ban the use of commercial spyware by organisations. So spyware that's effectively available to purchase commercially for organisations that can't create their own spyware. And they've banned that as an official thing because we saw that a lot of that kind of activity happening against the phones of government and very senior officials throughout the world through a couple of different organisations that were selling that. And we also saw international law enforcement operations. They took down the Quackbot botnet, which was responsible for spreading a lot of ransomware. And recently we've seen the takedown of the Lockbit ransomware, which is probably the highest incidence of ransomware that we've seen of any other kind of ransomware that's out there. And we saw Blue Callisto, a Russian group, which we also see Microsoft refer to as Star Blizzard, attempting to interfere in UK politics and democratic processes ahead of the elections there. And they've also gone after a number of other election organisations in the past 3 or 4 months. So I've spoken about the Russian actors and what they've been up to. Iranian actors have not been idle in relation to the war that's been happening with Hamas and Israel. They have been rapidly going after a lot of different open vulnerabilities on the internet that they see in relation to Israeli organisations to try and wipe those organisations or otherwise DDoS them. They're using a lot of AI in recruitment campaigns that they're using for phishing. And they've started to use a lot of impersonation type attacks in order to mask the fact of who is behind it. North Koreans mostly going after cryptocurrency companies because if they can steal the cryptocurrency and then they can cash it out to buy other things, they can do resale fraud, so they can sell the things that they're buying. That goes all back into the state's ability to purchase nuclear type arms and develop those kinds of programs, as well as solve a whole bunch of other economic problems that they've got as a result of sanctions. And the Chinese threat actors, again, started sharing a lot of tools between them, using these proxy and anonymization networks to go after a bunch of different organizations, doing it quite covertly to the point where it's very difficult to tell which group specifically is behind it, which is what they've had in the past is a big problem. The one thing that we can say more than anything is that there were a huge number of vulnerabilities that kept popping up in public-facing applications, particularly edge devices on the internet. Why do they go after these particular types of appliances? Partially because, honestly, the software in them is terrible, like the coding in them is terrible. And I think if you look at the number of edge devices that we've seen being compromised over the past year and the endless cycle of critical vulnerabilities that have been appearing in them, you kind of get the idea about which ones are potentially more trustworthy than others, and that's been a problem going forwards. I mentioned file transfer solution software, and we've also seen a lot of operational technology execution vulnerabilities start to appear. The reason behind that is not just to actually compromise operational technology in organizations that use a lot of machine-related software. It's also because a lot of machine-related software often is out of date or is impossible to update and is connected to the corporate network, which means if the actor can compromise the operational technology network, they then have a direct route into the corporate network if it's not properly segregated. So it's another way of getting in to that space, and we're starting to see a couple of actors exploit that. These are the 0 days that were discovered in 2023. You can see a steady stream of them coming out there right throughout the year. And then when we actually look at a case example of this, this is, again, the ransomware actor which I referred to as White Austerus, the one that does Clop ransomware. You see a timeline here. So Fortra, which was the actual vulnerability that was being the actual product that was being exploited, they release a private advisory of a 0 day in their software on the 30th of January. And then a security researcher releases a blog on that 0 day and a proof of concept that can be exploited on 6 February, so it's a week later. And then suddenly there's a module that's added to Metasploit, which is a common exploitation tool, to exploit that particular 0 day. Then we see a patch released for Go Anywhere immediately after that by Fortra in order to prevent actors doing that. But how many organizations have a 1 day patch cycle for any critical vulnerability? They don't. It's going to be at least 14 to 30 days, in many cases 90 days. But how soon did it take one of these actors to exploit the vulnerability? Literally 1 day. We saw the first active exploitation attempts observed. And then suddenly on the 6th of March, which is a few weeks later, we've got White Austerus adding a batch of 24 victims to the number of victims that started to appear. And then by the end of the 23rd of March, a week later, there's 130 different ransomware victims and leaked 103 by the end of March 2023, all the data of those victims. So you can see that the time from vulnerability revelation to exploitation is very, very short these days. Basically, there was essentially a lot of use of malware delivery systems and information stealers by ransomware actors to enable some of this. So the information stealers are there to steal credentials of legitimate users, but they're also there to steal multi-factor authentication. But if you want a single sort of thing to take away from how do I defend myself against ransomware actors, given they're everywhere at the moment, and I think at least about a week ago, there were 4 separate ransomware attacks against 4 separate hospitals in Sweden within 4 weeks, all of which were reduced to pen and paper. So it's a very real threat here in Sweden at the moment. If you want something to take away, open remote desktop protocol is one of the things that they're exploiting. So you shouldn't have that open where you don't need to have it open. And the other thing that's really obvious is the multi-factor authentication angle. So where you don't have multi-factor authentication on parts of the network that should be segregated from other parts of the network, where you don't have that protecting the parts of the network that give you access to all the key important crown jewels data that you have. That's the bit that the ransomware actors are going to go after. And that's the bit where you're going to lose all your data if you haven't deployed multi-factor authentication where you can. There's some statistics that give you an idea of specifically what those numbers are. So this is not like an objective thing in terms of like what ransomware victims are there like worldwide everywhere. This is more like what PwC has actually seen. So we dealt with 2,462 different cases of ransomware in 2022. This year it's 3,735 in 2023, and that number is only going to grow going forwards. You can see the sectors that they've been after as well. So manufacturing's right up the top there because they've got a lot of operational technology and other productivity-related systems that they can't afford to lose in order to function, in order to meet their bottom lines. Professional services were another one, especially managed service providers, and we saw that a lot here in Sweden. Then you've got technology organisation and so on and so forth down that. Where there isn't regulation over sectors, they go for those, and cryptocurrency is a perfect example of that because it's an easy sector for them to get into, where they're not defended by any kind of standards that would otherwise help protect them against some of these attacks. We did see the emergence of some Gen AI type attacks, particularly where there have been organisations where they've had users trying to get, hackers trying to get into the inside of the actual querying system for the AI software, whatever it happens to be, so that they can steal the inputs that the users provide into those systems. Because usually users are trying to summarize documents or other complex bits of information. They're not always aware of the sensitivity of some of the information that they're putting in there. And that's the thing that the hackers go after. They take that, they sell it on the dark web, and it reaps some enormous amounts of profit in that space. Same as if they can get hold of any kind of usernames, passwords, etc. Exactly the same thing. They go after those things and sell them on the dark web. So any kind of information they can get out of an organisation can make them money, and that's why they go after local municipalities and regions and such like that in Sweden. They can sell this information on the dark web, particularly if they don't actually pay the ransom. And an example of where we are seeing artificial intelligence being used as a threat vector, there's a lot of generation of phishing emails and other documents out there that are being generated by AI at the moment, and that's being seen absolutely all over the place with a number of different threat actors. The Iranians come to mind here, and this is an example of where the Iranians have generated a bunch of photographs of individuals using AI to put it on a fake recruitment website to get people looking for jobs to click on the website, and then they give up. Either they're actually infected by malware that's on the website, and usually this is like being propagated in order to get at dissidents, which the Iranians were after in many cases. What we actually expect to see in the next few years, obviously the criminals aren't going to stop what they're doing. We're not going to see the end of the Russia-Ukraine war in the very near future, it would seem. So that's obviously a hotbed of like new development in terms of malicious activity. A lot more leveraging of commodity malware to hide who's actually behind what's going on. Continuing exploitation of vulnerabilities and exploits. So unless we see a software code of practice start to be introduced across different nations, and we insist in Sweden that only things meeting a certain level of compliance can be provided to Swedish consumers, we'll see that continue. And most of all, because people are digitizing, going to the cloud, even though the cloud is honestly, in my opinion, the safest place for you to be, because your security is managed by professional organizations that actually understand their network and have threat intelligence teams looking at what's happening on those networks. Credentials are going to be the thing that allows a hacker to get into them. So protecting those through proper identity and access management solutions are going to be absolutely essential. I don't think I've got time for questions, however.
It's not up for you to decide. side, we have questions for you, Matt, because they're not on fire, but we have some questions coming in, and we're going to take time to ask them to you. You want to go first, Hannah?
Yeah, the first question was about backups and ransomware. So how can you be sure that the data you back up isn't already infected with ransomware that's set to go off at a later date?
It's a very, very good question. I think the first thing you do is actually when you back up, you actually make sure that you've actually looked at the backup in the first place and swept it for any kind of viruses in the first instance, and run your threat intelligence software over the top of it to ensure that there's nothing in there that you already know about. There's no absolute guarantee. The only thing that I would say is that you should store your backups offline, preferably cloud-based. If you're on the cloud, it's very easy to restore whatever data has been taken. If you're on-premise, it's not. And keep your encryption keys offline. If they're still on the online network and it's encrypted, you won't be able to open your backups.
Someone wants to know, do you have any idea how much ransomware attacks monetized in 2023 overall?
You mean the total amount?
Yeah.
It was probably, I think there was some estimate out there of 3 billion, but we don't really know. Honestly, there's a lot of organizations out there that are paying the ransom that we never hear about, so we don't really know how much, but given the number of actors out there doing it and the increase of activity, we know that everyone's getting paid. And we also see their Facebook groups sometimes where they're running around in camouflage Lamborghinis and things like that. So they're making money.
And then there was the question about where to best put your investment money-wise when it comes to cyber threats. Is it in upskilling? Is it in hardware? Is it in competence? Where do you recommend?
I think the most important thing is to actually do a security assessment against a proper cybersecurity standard, like NIST or like ISO 27001, work out where your vulnerabilities are, and then understand what you need to do about investment in terms of how you approach your risk and your security. That's my top tip. But if you're not going to do anything else, ensure that you've got multi-factor authentication everywhere that it counts, anywhere there's access to key data that you've got, and make sure that your privileged and access management accounts are properly secured and can't just be taken by just anyone if they wanted to.
Petra Klein was here earlier. She spoke about that they have a collaboration between the different big banks, lessons learned and bigger understanding and so on. And someone wants to know, do you do that as well? Meet with the other big four to work on these questions?
Well, the big four are competitors with each other, so we don't really exchange a huge amount of information in that sense. However, we do meet in similar forums with each other and gladly sort of exchange a certain amount of information on the threat and collaborate with each other. And we do that fairly regularly. So we meet with our competitors to discuss the threat actors and work out what each other knows. Occasionally we help each other out, and occasionally we collaborate on bits of research where some of us have got good access and others don't.
Yeah. Last one. Will you share this presentation afterwards?
I think parts of it will be available.
Yeah, okay, good.
Parts of it will be available. But you'll get the whole thing, basically, completely in the next few weeks. So you won't be long to wait if there's some slide in there that you don't already have access to.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. Let's give him an applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much.